Hey everybody, it's me, Miss Denny. Welcome to another edition of the Weekly Read. We have been reading The Boxcar Children, the original written in 1924 by Gertrude C. Warner. And today we'll be reading chapters 9 and 10. And if you've missed the previous chapters, don't worry, they're right here on our YouTube page. There's a playlist called The Weekly Read, and you can find the first 8 chapters on that playlist. So here we go. Let's jump right in to chapter 9, which is called Cherry Picking. Henry meditated a while all to himself early the next morning as to whether he ought to take anyone with him for the cherry picking. He certainly said he could use more than one, he mused. Failing to decide the question, he laid it before his sisters as they ate bread and milk for breakfast. I can't see any reason except one why we shouldn't all go, said Jess. What's that? Asked Henry. Well, you see there are 4 of us, and supposing grandfather is looking for us, it will be easier to find 4 than 1. True, Henry agreed. But supposing we went down the hill and through the streets 2 by 2, and you took watch. It was finally agreed that Henry and Benny would attract very little attention together. Violet and Jess would follow with the dog, who would trace Henry, and so they set out. They took down the clothesline and closed the car door. Everything instantly looked as lonesome as heart could wish. Even the merry little brook looked deserted. When the children arrived at the McAllister orchard, they soon saw that they were not the only workers. 2 hired men and the young doctor himself were carrying ladders and baskets from the barn, and the Irish cook was bringing piles of square baskets from the house, the kind that strawberries are sold in. The girls can pick cherries as well as I can, said Henry, introducing his sisters. Benny ought not to climb very tall trees, but we had to bring him. Benny can carry the baskets, perhaps, suggested the doctor, much amused. You see, this is a cherry year, and we have to work quickly once we begin. Perhaps he could fill the small baskets from the big ones. It was a cherry year, certainly. There were 2 varieties in the orchard, the pale yellow kind with a red cheek, and the deep crimson ones, which are just as red in the center as they were on the outside. The red ones were huge, bursting with juice, and the trees were laden full with the luscious fruit. Even the air was perfumed. It was a pretty sight that the doctor finally turned his back upon when he went on his calls. Henry, slim, tanned, and graceful, picked rapidly from the tallest ladder in the largest tree. The 2 girls in their sensible bloomer suits could climb like cats. They leaned against their ladders easily about halfway up, their fluffy short hair gleaming in the sun. Benny trotted to and fro, waiting upon the busy pickers, his cheeks as red as the cherries themselves. Eat all you want, Dr. McAllister called back. They did not really obey this command, but occasionally set a white teeth bit into one of the glorious ox hearts. In less than an hour, Benny had made 5 firm friends. The hired men joked with him, the cook petted him, the young doctor laughed at him delightedly, and sweet Mrs. McAllister fell in love with him. Finally, he seated himself comfortably at her side under the trees and filled square boxes with great care under her direction. I never had such a cheerful crowd of cherry pickers before, Mrs. McAllister said at last. I'd much rather stay out here than go into the house where it is cool. Evidently, Mary the cook felt the same way, for she kept coming to the orchard for some reason or other. When the doctor returned at lunchtime, his orchard was ringing with laughter, and good-natured barks from Watch could not feel easy in his mind with his mistress so high up in a tree where he couldn't follow. Dr. McAllister paused in the garage long enough to give a sniff to the boiling cherries in the kitchen, and then had made his way to the orchard, where he received a warm welcome. There's no use in your going home to lunch, he smilingly observed, at the same time watching Henry's face carefully. You can eat right here in the orchard unless your mother will be worrying about you. This remark met with an astounding silence. Henry was the first to collect his wits. No, our mother is dead, he said evenly, without embarrassment. It was the doctor who hastened to change the subject he had introduced. I smelled something when I came in, he said to Benny. It smelled like cherry slump, replied the doctor with twinkling eyes. Cherry what? Asked Jess, struggling down her ladder with a full basket. I think that's what they call it, slump, repeated Dr. McAllister. Do you care to try it? At this moment, Mary appeared in the orchard with an enormous tray. At the first sight of her cookery, nobody cared the least what its name was. It was that rare combination of dumpling beaten with stoned cherries and cooked gently in the juice of the oxheart cherries in a real cherry year. It was steaming in the red juice with the least suspicion of melted butter over the whole. Do get 2 more, Mary, begged Mrs. McAllister, laughing. It tastes so much better under the cherry trees. This was another meal that nobody ever forgot. Even the 2 hired men sitting under another tree devouring the delicious pudding paused to hear Benny laugh. Nowadays, those 2 men sometimes meet Henry, but that's another story. Anyway, they never will forget that cherry slump made by Irish Mary. Almost as soon as lunch was over, Benny rolled over on the grass and went to sleep, his head, as usual, on the dog's back. But the others worked on steadily. Mrs. McAllister kept an eye on them from the screened porch without their knowledge. Just see how those children keep at it, she said to her son. There is good stuff in them. I should like to know where they come from. Dr. McAllister said nothing. He sauntered out to the orchard when he thought they had worked long enough. He paid them $4 and gave them all the cherries they could carry, although they tried to object. You see, you're better than most pickers because you're so cheerful. He noticed that they did not all leave the yard at the same time. When the cherry pickers returned to their little home, they examined everything carefully. Nothing had been disturbed. The door was still shut, and the milk and butter stood untouched in the refrigerator. They made a hilarious meal of raw cherries and bread and butter, and before the stars came out, they were fast asleep, happy and dreamless. That evening, very much later, a young man sat in his study with the evening paper. He read the news idly and was just on the point of tossing the paper aside when this advertisement caught his eye. Lost. 4 children, aged 13, 12, 10, and 5, somewhere around the region of Middlesex and Townsend. $5,000 reward for information. James Henry Courtesy. Whew, whistled the young man. James Henry Courtesy. He sat in perfect silence for a long time thinking. Then he went to bed. But long after he had gone upstairs, he whistled again and could have been heard to say it if anyone could have been awake to hear it. James Henry Courtesy, of all people. That was the end of chapter 9. Now we will read chapter 10, called The Race. The Courtesy steel mills stood a little aside from the city of Greenfield, as if they were a little too good to associate with common factories. James Henry Courtesy sat in a huge leather chair in his private office. He was a man nearly 60 years of age, whose dark brown hair was still untouched by any gray. He had rather hard lines around his mouth, but softer ones around his eyes. Printed on the ground glass top of his door were these words in black and gold. J.H. Courtesy, President, Private. Once a year, J.H. Courtesy allowed himself a holiday. If he had a weakness, it was for healthy boys. Boys running without their hats, boys jumping, boys throwing rings, boys swimming, boys vaulting with a long pole. And in company with 3 other extremely rich men, he arranged once a year a field day for the town of Intervale. The men attended it in person and supplied all the money. This was field day. All through the spring and early summer months, boys were in training for miles around, getting ready for Intervale's field day. And not only boys, but men also, old and young, and girls of all ages into the bargain. Prizes were offered for tennis, baseball, rowing, swimming, running, and every imaginable type of athletic feat. But usually the interest of the day centered on a free-for-all race of 1 mile, which everyone enjoyed, and a great many people entered. A prize of $25 was offered to the winner of this race, and also a silver trophy cup with little wings on its handles. Sometimes this cup was won by a middle-aged man, sometimes by a girl, and sometimes by a trained athlete. Mr. Courtesy smiled about his eyes as he closed his desk and ordered his limousine, and went out and locked the door of his office. The mill had been closed down for the day. Everyone attended field day. Henry was washing the concrete drives at Dr. McAllister's at this moment. He heard the doctor call to him from the road, so he promptly turned off the hose and ran out to see what was wanted. "Hop in," commanded the doctor, not stopping his engine. "You ought to see the stunts at this athletic meet. It's field day." Henry did not wish to delay the doctor, so he hopped in. "Can't go myself," said Dr. McAllister. "I'll just drop you at the grounds. There's no charge for admittance. You just watch all the events and report to me who wins." Henry tried to explain to his friend that he ought to be working, but there was actually no time. When he found himself seated on the bleachers and the stunts began, he forgot everything in the world except the exciting events before his eyes. Henry had no pencil, but he had an excellent memory. He repeated over and over the name of each winner as it appeared on the huge signboard. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the free-for-all running race was announced. "What do you mean, free-for-all?" asked Henry of a small boy at his side. "Why, just anybody," explained the boy curiously. "Didn't you ever see one? Didn't you see the one last year?" "No," said Henry. The boy laughed. "That was a funny one," he said. "There was a college runner in it, and a couple of fat men and some girls and lots of people. And the little colored boy over there won it. You just ought to have seen that boy run. He went so fast you couldn't see his legs. Beat the college runner, you know." Henry gazed at the winner of last year's race. He was smaller than Henry, but apparently older. In a few minutes, Henry had quietly left his place on the bleachers. When the boy turned to speak to him again, he was gone. He had gone, in fact, to the dressing room, where boys of all sizes were putting on sandals and running trunks. The man stepped up to him quickly. "Want to enter?" he asked. "No time to waste." "Yes," replied Henry. The man tossed him a pair of white shoes and some blue trunks. He liked the look of Henry's face as he paused to ask in an undertone, "Where did you train?" "Never trained," replied Henry. "I suppose you know these fellows have been training all the year," observed the man. "You don't expect to win." "Oh, no," replied Henry, apparently shocked at the idea. "But it's lots of fun to run, you know." He was dressed and ready by this time. How light he felt. He felt as if he could almost fly. Presently, the contestants were all marshaled out to the running track. Henry was number 4. Now, Henry had never been trained to run, but the boy possessed an unusual quantity of common sense. "It's a mile race," he thought to himself, "and it's the second half mile that counts." So it happened that this was the main thought in his mind when the starter's gong sounded and the racers shot away down the track. In almost no time, Henry was far behind the first half of the runners. But strangely enough, he did not seem to mind this greatly. "It's fun to run anyhow," he thought. It was fun, certainly. He felt as if his limbs were strung together on springs. He ran easily, without effort, each step bounding into the next like an elastic. After a few minutes of this, Henry had a new thought. Now you've tried how easy you can run, let's see how fast you can run." Then not only Henry himself, but the enormous crowd as well began to see how fast he could run. Slowly he gained on the fellow ahead of him and passed him. With the next fellow as a goal, he gradually crept alongside and passed him with a spurt. The crowd shouted itself hoarse. The field all along the course was black with people. Henry could hear them cheering for number 4 as he pounded by. 6 runners remained ahead of him. Here was the kind of race the crowd loved, not an easily won affair between 2 runners, but a gradual victory between the best runner and overpowering odds. Henry could see the finish flag in the distance. He began to spurt. He passed numbers 14 and 13. He passed 25, 6, and 1, almost in a bunch. Number 16 remained ahead. Then Henry began to think of winning. How much the $25 prize would mean to Jess and the rest. Number 16 must be passed. "I'm going to win this race," he said quietly in his own mind. "I'll bet you I am." The thought lent him speed. Number 4, number 4, yelled the crowd. Henry did not know that the fellow ahead had been ahead all the way, and just because he, Henry, had slowly gained over them all, the crowd loved him best. Henry waited until he could have touched him. He was within 3 yards of the wire. He bent double and put all his energy into the last elastic bound. He passed number 16 and shot under the wire. Then the crowd went wild. It scrambled over and under the fence, cheering and blowing its horns. Henry felt himself lifted on many shoulders and carried, panting, up to the reviewing stand. He bowed, laughing at the sea of faces, and took the silver cup with its little wings in a sort of dream. It is a wonder he did not lose the envelope containing the prize, for he hardly realized when he took it what it was. Then someone said, "What's your name, boy?" That called him to earth. He had to think quickly under cover of getting his breath. There's Henry after he won the race on the shoulders of some other boys. And the caption says, Henry felt himself lifted on many shoulders. Henry James, he replied. This was perfectly true as far as it went. In a moment, the enormous signboard flashed out the name, Henry James, number 4, age 13, winner of Free for All. Meanwhile, the man of the dressing room was busy locating Mr. Courtesy of the Courtesy Mills. He knew what was exactly the kind of story that old James Henry would like. Yes, sir, he said, smiling. I says to him, you don't expect to win, of course. And he says to me, oh no, but it's lots of fun to run, you know. Thank you, sir, returned Mr. Courtesy. That's a good story. Bring the youngster over here if you don't mind. When Henry appeared, a trifle shaken out of his daze and anxious only to get away, Mr. Courtesy stretched out his hand. I like your spirit, my boy, he said. I like your running too, but it's your spirit that I like best. Don't ever lose it. Thank you, said Henry, shaking hands. There was only one in the whole crowd that knew who was shaking hands with whom, least of all, James Henry and Henry James. That's the end of chapter 10. Join me again next week. We'll pick up where we left off today with chapter 11 called The More Education. Thanks so much for joining me, friends. See you next time.